should all be getting your papers back shortly, either in sometime in the next session. We had an opportunity to go over them. I got some feedback from the discussion leaders, and generally positive feedback. A couple of things were quite clear, I think, that probably are worth reiterating to many of you, because they're kind of common problems that I find not simply among undergraduates, but among many people writing, even when I review papers for book manuscripts or others. And it's the tendency to talk in generalizations, especially about when attributing agency. So you talk about New Yorkers gain from industrialization, or government-created problems. In both of those cases, there are usually rather specific players that gain and some lose. And so part of the effort here is, in fact, to get you to talk a little bit about which social groups are gaining and losing or winning or playing in these kind of processes. So you want to avoid conversations that talk about the people without describing which people you have in mind, or the government without talking about the government's change. A government under Ed Koch did things differently than under Dinkins or under Giuliani or under Bloomberg. State governments do things differently than federal governments. City governments do things. There are conflicts within those governments one needs to talk about. When we've talked about sanitation, we've talked about the ways in which sanitation is developed, but it's developed unevenly. Some people get it much earlier than other people. So some people have certain kinds of power and other people don't. So you want to be much more concrete in the kind of conversations that you're having, the analysis in these papers. So when you're talking, for instance, about social policy, it's an opportunity to really talk about who's making that policy and who's differentially affected by such policies. It's that kind of analysis that we want to see you bring to the table. Okay? What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. But what's true for roses is not always true for the politics of the past or for those of the present. My case in point is the subject of today's presentation, an event which has come down to us with the name, the Stonecutters riot. Surely this was not the name the Stonecutters would have given to the event. So today I want to try to explore with you what their version of the story might have been like, and in hearing it, begin to think, first of all, about what they might have called the event and why that might matter, why naming might matter. Second, in suggesting that naming matters, I want to make special effort to talk about the social policy that's then based on the ability to name, to decide what the problem is. If you decide the problem is laziness, you have one set of solutions. If you decide the problem is exploitation, you have a different set of solutions. So naming matters. And I want to talk about how it might matter in terms of policy, in terms of social history. Social policy is based on the ability of any one group or another to authorize their version of events. And we inherit those versions through newspaper accounts, through historians' versions of these things. And as you know from having read your history, they don't always say the same thing. Detour for a moment. Brings me back to your papers. I want to remind you about another thing, and that's about primary sources versus secondary sources. I don't know how much background you've had from secondary school or other university and college classes, but on the whole, secondary sources are not evidence of anything. They have evidence in them that you want to use. So they make an argument, but what matters to us is the evidence in those books that convinces you that you want to draw upon that material. So on the whole, you generally never quote from secondary sources unless they say something that's so extraordinarily pithy that it carries a particular resonance about the event. You quote from primary sources. You use your secondary sources for the evidence that's in them that you cite, and then you footnote them because that's where you got the evidence from. Otherwise, we call it plagiarism. Okay? So there are kind of rules of evidence, but I want you to emphasize and think about when you're reading material, whether it's my lectures or Gotham or any of the other reading, that you really have to be convinced by the evidence that they muster, not the fact that they simply told you it was so. Okay? Hold them accountable, as I hope you'll account me accountable and your discussion leaders accountable for the evidence that we muster on behalf of the arguments we make, not just by the fact that we stand up in front of you. Okay? And you'll be held accountable in the same way. Just as you would hold your mates accountable if they were making an argument for why you should be supporting Party A or Party B in an election. It wouldn't be just because, hopefully, the good looks of a candidate or another, or because you want to curry favor with them, but because of the argument they'd be making about the policy, and you'd want to see that supported. So it's the same criteria we're talking about here. Back to our story. The ability to authorize a story. Whose stories gain traction in history creates policy. So today I want to share with you my detective work in trying to fill out the history of a very particular kind of event, the Stonecutters riot, as it was called, and the Stonecutters' perspective in it. Now, I first learned about the topic when I was first hired at NYU, before you were all born, probably, a long, long time ago, in the late 70s. And I was teaching a course on violence in American history. And there was a book that was published in 1873, old book, by a man named Joel Tyler Headley. And his book was called The Great Riots of New York, 1712 to 1873. So he was covering all the old riots during the period. And in it, there was one short little passage, 233 pages, 20 chapters, numerous events, all characterized as riots, and concluded with a detailed set of chapters on the four-day riot that we're going to end on before the midterm exam, which is the draft riot, which we'll come back to later. But a paragraph tacked on to the end of a chapter on anti-abolitionist riots in 1834 and 35 summarized what he called the Stonecutters riot. So I'll read you all that I knew about this event from Tyler. The contractors for the building of the New York University found, I'm going to be going over this so you can just actually listen if you'd like. Okay. Contractors for the building of New York University found that they could purchase dressed stone. That means stone that's already been worked on, not stone with top hats and tails. Okay. Dressed stone at Sing Sing, the prison. The work of the prisoners there being much cheaper than that in New York City. And so they concluded to use it. This, the stonecutters of the city said, was taking the bread out of their mouths, and if allowed to go on, would destroy their business. They held excited meetings on the subject and finally got up a procession and paraded the streets with placards asserting their rights and denouncing the contractors. They even attacked the homes of some of the citizens, already a prejudicial word there, some of the citizens, not the contractors of Sing Sing prison labor, right, of the citizens, and assumed such a threatening attitude that the 27th Regiment, Colonel Stevens, leader, was called out. Passive construction was called out. They're not telling you who's doing the calling, right? Somebody has authority and is deciding the regiment should be called out. Their steady, determined march on the rioters dispersed them and restored quiet. Apprehensions were felt, however, that they would reassemble in that night and vent their rage on the university building. And so a part of the regiment encamped in Washington Square in full view of it. They remained here 4 days and nights until the excitement subsided and the work would go on unmolested. So that's all I knew. I didn't have tenure yet. I waited another year, got tenured, and then I decided I'd write up the riot. It's the politics of universities, among other kinds of things, right? In fact, the dean in your introductions as freshmen now actually cites the riot, since I work for him when I was the director of college honors and now experiential education. He's now read this story and he's comfortable including it into the narrative of New York City, New York University. do you know what building we're talking about? Where the site of the building is we'd be talking about. It was used to be called Main Building. It's now called Silver Center. So we're talking about the building that's right here on the corner. It's Washington Square East, the northeast corner of Washington Square. That's the site of the building. There are placards on that building. Have any of you looked at the placards and see the historical placards? And what do they tell you?
I don't remember. I just remember looking at them vaguely.
All right. Yes.
Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire.
Well, that's on the plaque. You're quite right. There is a placard for that, but it's not on that building on that corner. That's on the building. That's that whole complex of buildings. There are actually 4 buildings, and so the building that placard is on is called Brown Building, which is the southeast corner of those 4 units. So there is a placard for that, and they all are connected now buildings, but that was a separate building as it was built. The building we're talking about is the northeast corner. There is no placard there for this ride. There are 2 placards there. One talks about the founding of a chemical society, I think, and the other one, I think, talks about some of the early founders of NYU. You'd have to go back and look at it. But there's no mention. It has been eluded from the history as, again, an historical marker, which in its own way is worth thinking about. So that's what I knew. Hedley's account. This is the story we would know for the next century because that's all that existed, the book that was used by him. We knew that to save money, contractors for a building of New York University arranged to purchase stone cut by the prisoners from Sing Sing prison. And we know that the stonecutters protested it with a procession and a parade in which, as rioters, as they're described, okay, they attacked the houses of some citizens. And remember again, the language of rioting presumes that these are therefore people who are irrational, behaving out of control. So they were often the term that's used interchangeably. And think about it in terms of the other book that I've asked you to read. The word mob is what's used in association with these people rather than a crowd. Rather than presuming there's a logic, it comes from the work of, mentioned to you perhaps before, Gustave Le Bon, French writer who talks about the mob in history and the idea of the mob, meaning that it's an assemblage of unthinking, irrational people. Implicit in that, of course, are assumptions about how one ought to respond to them. If they're irrational, obviously, you've got to knock common sense into their heads. If you think that there's something rational about what they're doing, then you want to try to argue and debate with them and have a conversation about what the grievances are. So in describing them as rioters, already is presuming that it's a group of people who are, quote, out of control. Okay? So that's what this book was about. The book was about a history of rioting in New York. We learned that it attacked some citizens and that the 27th Regiment was called out to quell the disturbance and that it was camped on Washington Square Park for 4 days. Now you should know that calling upon the regiment for what we would call social control, maintaining social order, had become a byword for the era. It was a new kind of default response by the authorities, meaning people in power and political power who have the authority to call out the regiment. So the stonecutters couldn't say, please call out the regiment. It had to come from the mayor's office. Okay? The regiment, in fact, had been mobilized for domestic policing 3 times that year alone. It had never been called out before. So it suddenly had become a new form of social default action. When in trouble, if there seems to be dispute, we call out the regiment to create order. And it's all happening in this year, 1834, which, as I suggested to you at the end of lecture last time, it's called in New York the year of the riot. And we need to think a little bit about what's happening in 1834 that would suddenly cause this kind of shift in public policy and in behavior. Well, that's all I knew about the riot, what Hedley wrote. Reliance on this kind of paramilitary, the National Guard, had become the security answer of the era. But I also knew a few other facts that piqued my interest in the case. First, I knew that no one at NYU knew anything about it. I thought that was pretty interesting. I knew that the building at the site, the corner of Waverly Place and Washington Square East, had these other historical markers for more upbeat events, right? The founding of the Chemical Society. Second, I knew something about this guy who wrote this book. What kind of historian was he? What kind of scholar was he? What was his point of view? What kind of research had he done? How reliable was this information? Where was he getting this information? Well, who was he? Well, Joe Tyler Headley was actually a pretty well-known guy at the time. He had a very particular and rather jaundiced agenda that shaped probably his point of view and his interests. He was a prolific journalist. He was a Whig and had been a know-nothing politician. Now, the Know-Nothings were a nativist political organization, very active in the 1840s and 1850s in the United States and in New York City. They were virulently anti-immigrant, racist, anti-Catholic. Okay? And he was an active member of that organization as well. Okay? These, in the wake of, and that this was all happening in the same time that America was being caught up with notions of our manifest destiny. Remember, 1846 is when we're involved in the Spanish-American War, when we're taking Mexican War, when we're actually going to be, at the end of that, not only taking over the area that will be Texas, but ultimately all of the West. The settlement will give us all of California and the far West as well. So it was an era, really, of American expansionism, of a notion that we, in fact, were a great country destined for greatness. And all of that was a part of it. You'll also, of course, remember some of the things that we... so he's writing in the wake of all of that. Okay? Remember, he's writing in 73 about this event in 34 and all of these earlier events, these riots. In the wake of this simultaneous enthusiasm for America's manifest destiny, we had seen much of today's West annexed by the United States, and we'd seen new social fears of convulsions of these riots seem to threaten the national mission. They seemed to threaten our capacity, in fact, to demonstrate that we were to be, in the words that had been constantly used, God's country, words that were increasingly being used in mid-century. Such men like Headley generally believed that only irrational, backwards-looking people opposed the march of progress, on which the American nation was embarked. His logic was what I would call the logic of the counting house. It was a logic that presumed that progress was associated with accumulation, with capital accumulation, and the rioters in rioting weren't understanding the logic of capital. They were against progress in some way and therefore had to be contained. Accordingly, it should be noted that Tyler dedicates his book to the Metropolitan Police. Here's from the cover: The Great Riots of New York, including a full and complete history of the 4 days draft riot of 1863. So he's writing this book right after the draft riots, and the dedication on the next page is to the Metropolitan Police, whose unwavering fidelity and courage in the past are a sure guarantee of what they will do for New York City in the future. This work is respectfully inscribed by the author. So he's also dedicated the whole book to the police, this new Metropolitan Police Force, about which we're going to hear a little more in the next few weeks. It is not simply the city police force. It was a city force that was being created in opposition to the local city force that was run by the Democratic machine. This new Metropolitan Police Force was made up overwhelmingly of rural white folks from the outer boroughs, who they thought would be more efficient, respectful of property rights, and could replace the local city police force. And they were seen as a group similar to the National Guard, as a celebration of these people, the loyal and hard-fought struggle that they were fighting on behalf of progress. So his introduction concludes with the hope that the history of what he called mobs, behavior of unthinking, irrational people, would stimulate support for what he thought to be the solution. And he argues that in the book. I'll read you briefly from his introduction, just to give you a quick sense of my evidence for what he's saying here. He's arguing that we need the creation of a paramilitary force of 500, quote, drilled in such evolutions, maneuvers, and modes of attack that, quote, they will scatter 5,000 rioters like chaff before them. So he's hoping that this book will help to create a public pressure, public awareness of the need to create this paramilitary force that can provide social order and progress for the city. He writes, the simplest, this again is from his introduction, I'm just going to read you a paragraph. The simplest, most efficient, and most economical plan would be to select 500 or more of the most courageous, experienced, and efficient men from the police force. Read, by the way, there, that means non-immigrant and not Irish. Okay? That's what that translates to largely, unless they're willing to behave according to his mandates. Okay? And form them into a separate battalion. He's suggesting, in other words, to create a separate force out of the police. Have them drilled in such evolutions, maneuvers, and modes of attack or defense as they would belong to the work they are set apart to do. A battery might be given to them in case of certain emergencies, and a portion carefully trained in its use. In other words, they are to be specially armed. Okay? At a certain signal of a bell, they should be required to hasten without a moment's delay to their headquarters. A mob could hardly be gathered and commence work before this solid body of disciplined, reliable men, meaning reliable to the people who were calling upon them to do their work, okay, would be upon them. These 500 men, the quote I gave you a minute ago, would scatter 5,000 riders like chaff before them. It would be more efficient than 2 entire regiments, even if assembled, and would be worth more than the whole military of the city for the first half day. So his response to the draft riot, he's arguing, is to write this book to convince New Yorkers that we need a respectable kind of paramilitary within the police force that can be used in these kind of emergency situations. Okay? So Headley's name for the event constructed it as a problem of disorder, a riot by stonecutters. And accordingly, his policy recommendation was to argue that the problem was best met by police, by military force, or by surveillance. A policy which, in fact, became, it should be noted, the preferred social policy of politicians, much as it continues to inform the views of current policymakers. So you need to understand, it seems to me, that he was successful in convincing people that this was a useful strategy to pursue. And the kind of paramilitaries that exist in the Los Angeles police force and virtually all of our police forces today come from this moment.
When did you write?
1873. Another thing, just so you know, 1873 is the first year of the first great American industrial depression. It lasts 4 years, from 73 to 77. We'll come back to that another time. There also are riots occurring at other places like Tompkins Square at that time, so it's a constant set of concerns and anxieties that are animating all of this. Okay? So, I thought it was time to seek out a fuller account of the supposed riot and see if the voices of the stonecutters were those of an irrational mob. Did they share the logic of the counting house, or did they have their own logic, and what was that logic? So the story begins in 1833. It begins in a decision by a group of men, leaders of commercial ascendants in New York City, to build their own university. There was this Anglican university, as you know, uptown. Okay? They wanted one now. It wasn't, in fact, very far uptown at that time. It was really just in Midtown. Okay? But they want their own university. It was to build New York University, to erect the first building then adjacent to Washington Square Park. For, in fact, the site was paradigmatic, as I suggested last time, of changes taking place in the whole city at the time. It was also paradigmatic of the changes in what I would call social relations, the ways in which people were relating to one another, and the anxieties that those changes were often creating among people, where they no longer could count on on deference. They could no longer count on people knowing their place. People were getting uppity. People were being anxious about now being told you have to be a dependent wage laborer. You can be hired, you can be fired. These are all new conditions that are pretty unsettling to folks. Okay? And not just at the bottom, also at the top. People who are employers are finding new uppity employers are charging less money for the same goods and are undercutting them and making them anxious. So the anxiety is at all levels in the social structure. Okay? And it's being manifested in a whole range of different ways. This is only one manifestation of that anxiety. Just to give you a sense, we'll talk about a little later, but at this exact same time, there were revivalist meetings all through New York City concerned with female moral reform and anxieties about prostitution and about wicked city women. And it's female moral reform anxieties that start in New York, and you can trace all those revival meetings. They follow the Hudson River and the Erie Canal. All of those cities become known as, especially the cities along the Erie Canal, as the burnt-over district. Okay? Exactly at this time, burnt over meaning excited by this feverish imagination, these feverish revivalisms that are being caused, being excited, and revival that was about these changing relationships among men, women, work. Same moment, to give you another sense of what's happening. The Shakers. Anybody know who the Shakers were? Come on, somebody knows the Shakers.
They had a funny dance and made chairs.
Yes, but they weren't dancing funny when they made the chairs, probably, but they did both. Yes.
Are they the ones who were against sexual relations with one another?
Well, they are a utopian community that forms in the 1830s. There are a whole range of utopian communities that form in the 1830s. There's a book written about them, also in the middle of the 19th century, at the same time as Headley's writing. It's a book by a man named Noyes, you can go look up, called The History of American Socialisms. And it's about all these utopian experiments. You know the Shakers. If you want to see, by the way, a Shaker community, you can go see the Shaker Village, which is located on the border between Massachusetts and New York, just to the east of Troy.
Similar to the Quakers, they wouldn't speak, they'd be silent until they feel the need to shake. Men and women lived in separate
That's right.
Buildings. You gained, they didn't procreate at all, but they would gain new members by taking children.
Well, they gained new members because people believed in what they were doing.
Yes. And they were great architects. They were great builders. They had very clean, like it was a very new modern style. If you look at the houses that they built, very similar to 1950s.
It is actually quite similar to like Danish modern, the simple design from the 50s, or you might even see in Lloyd Wright kind of architectural work, what we would mission architecture. They're one community. A second one was the Oneida community. Those are the two of the most famous, but they're all around this area as well. There's the North American Phalanx, which is in northern New Jersey. So there are people in places like New York City who are anxious about these new wage relations, and they're attracted to places, to these other kinds of communities, which are also challenges to industrialization, because they're saying, against the wage system, we're getting rid of all money. We don't believe in money. So in fact, you went to these communities and you gave up all your money. And you worked together for God. And the Oneida community also believed that that women were effectively part of the capitalist system and their ownership of women. So they also believed in free love, in which men and women didn't own one another, but in fact engaged in cohabitation and co-partnership. The Oneida community procreated. The Shaker community believed in no sexuality. But it's extraordinary. You'd think they die out, but in fact they continue to grow because so many people were attracted to the idea of a community that was not tied to to this new kind of wage system and at this moment. So at the same time that you have industrialization, you have these movements that in their own way are industrial and anti-industrial, because in fact they do extraordinary industrial design work, but with almost, and in fact they create forms of technology in the organization of work that they do. So if you go up to the Shaker community, it's a great trip and a great museum to see near Stockbridge, Massachusetts, if people know that area, or Lenox, Massachusetts, or Albany, between those two areas. They have very efficient designs of everything from brushes to chairs to furniture. They did laundry work. They created effectively a laundry system with chutes in which the laundry went through. It went to another place, and then people collected it, and then it went through washers and wringers, and then was ironed and pressed. They created a kind of an assembly line for laundry production, all done without technologies, because they didn't believe in machines either. The point only is to understand that at the same time as wage relations are being created, there are people who are also involved in these kind of movements to oppose this kind of wage system. So we have at the same moment female moral reform, anxieties about women's sexuality. We have utopian communities being formed. We have abolitionism, okay, taking off. Remember I told you that 31, 32 are the moments when the British and the French governments are for the first time declaring slavery in their colonies to be illegal, and the United States remains one of the last places still with a slave, committed to slavery. But there is an anti-abolitionist movement also gaining enormous power, including resistance, Turner's Rebellion, and the publication of The Liberator, again, 31, 32, 33, all of these same years. So we have enormous upheaval, and the upheaval is mostly in this area starting from New York up the Hudson River to the burnt-over district. So if you were to look, for instance, at the first schools of female education, you'd go to Russell Sage College in Troy, New York. If you were going to look for the publication of The Liberator, it would be Rochester, New York, where Douglass was publishing. If you were to look at female moral reform movements, it starts in New York City with the revival by a man named Finney and goes up the Hudson River all the way across Rochester to Buffalo. So it's that entire, Utica, Rochester, Buffalo, it's that entire chain coming out of New York, all excited by these same things that are now exciting these riots in New York. They're all of a piece. I'll come back to those other pieces later. For today, we're back to this riot. Okay, what do we know? We know the Erie Canal had opened. We know that the city had become a gateway to these Western markets. We know that things had changed dramatically. We also know that there were social consequences to this growth. The promise of cheap labor, of jobs, attracted and filled Lower Manhattan with often poor people. It came with disease. We talked about yellow fever. We talked about cholera. And we talked about how the city fathers had buried people in a pauper's burial ground, but now with the spread of cholera, in fact, people don't want to live downtown anymore. They want to move uptown. So in 1826, the pauper's burial ground becomes the military parade ground for the 27th Regiment. And who, by the way, is in the 27th Regiment? First of all, how many women paraded, do you think? Okay, so it's male. It is a male space. It is a place for men to preen themselves, to display masculinity, and on the whole, affluent, wealthy men. Okay, so it is a elite space that is created from what had been a pauper's burial ground, and the houses around it become the beginning of a kind of residential segregation. Those lovely townhouses we see on the north side of the park are all created from that period in the 1830s, at the same moment that we're talking about. Okay? So there's all kinds of social order and reordering going on, including geographic mobility, social mobility, all at the same time. Regardless of all this, NYU understood, these new NYU leaders understood prison labor was cheap. They had been advised, the leaders of this new institution, that the marble would cost them about $10,000. But the governors were encouraged to believe that the marble would eventually be given to them for free by the state if they used the prison labor. Now, to be fair, I discovered the university could use the money. It didn't have your tuition. sorry to say, didn't have the advantage of your tuition. It thought about that later and developed a very good strategy for that. Continues to do so. But they realized they needed some other source of income. In fact, the balance in their account at the time was discovered $66.46. That was hardly enough to build Main Building. So they knew they needed the money. To be fair, I also learned that the stonecutters felt they could use the money too. Their work had changed dramatically during industrialization, becoming increasingly more dependent and insecure. For, as I've suggested, 1834 is not simply a moment of what we might call takeoff for growth. It is also a tumultuous moment of uncertainty, as I've suggested. And the lives of the stonecutters were emblematic. The changing of work of stonecutters was emblematic. The work of a stonecutter in the early 19th century was an artisanal tradition. The work of masons, stonecutters, marble cutters, they were all related trades. And the early credo of the masons suggested their sense of their rights, of the dignity of labor, and their sense of justice. I'll read you their credo. And when you took an oath as a stonecutter or a mason, this is what you said. I pay my debts. I steal from no man. Would not cut a throat to gain admission to a great man's purse or a whore's bed. I'd not betray my friend. Their notions of sexuality, you see, and propriety are interesting, right? I'd not betray my friend to get his place or fortune. I learn neither to flatter a blown-up fool above me, nor crush the wretch below me. So there was this extraordinary sense of kind of brotherhood and fraternity that they took as an oath among the brotherhood of stonecutters. Relations between apprentices and masters reflected this code. They were honor-bound and almost familial. When you wanted to become a stonecutter, you went to a master or were hired by a master, and you went and lived in their house. You were trained. You became a member of their family. And even after the apprenticeship, you continued to look after one another. You were, again, part of a brotherhood. It was a 7-year apprenticeship, after which the most talented might move on and do more ornamental work, gravestones and that sort of thing. Okay? Or you might even become a sculptor. But if one possessed the ability to draw or had the skill with a chisel, and if one had the opportunity, it was possible to gain some experience doing ornamental marble work that was traditionally had been associated with Italian craftsmen. So there were real opportunities doing this. It was a craft. It was a skill. It was highly valued. Okay? What we would call in the 19th century, in a way in which we don't quite understand as much in the 20th century, the dignity of labor, the dignity of working with your hands. Such was the experience of one such stonecutter whose diary I found at the New York Historical Society. His name was John Frazee, F-R-A-Z-E-E. And he left, as I say, a biography, an autobiography. He was a trained stonecutter who actually, and the reason he left an autobiography, he actually became quite successful. He rose to become one of the country's first native-born sculptors. He was born in Rahway, New Jersey, in 1790. He received little help from his father, Reuben, a carpenter by trade, who was also, unfortunately, a rather dissolute alcoholic. But young John was taught the most domestic crafts, spinning and carding. We talked about those earlier in textiles. And farming by his grandparents who raised him. But they quickly learned that he had the skill. He was a good drawer. He was quite skilled with his hands. And he drew images on walls, on pictures, and he gained the nickname a limmer, an L-I-M-M-E-R, which meant simply somebody who was good, was often associated with people who were strolling portrait painters, that he had the ability to reproduce a likeness of people. It seemed this was the kind of skill that might go into sculpting later, but into stone cutting work. So at the age of 14, he was bound over to a bricklayer and a plasterer plasterer meaning somebody who would work like mason, a man by the name of William Lawrence, for whom his father at the time also worked. Now, being bound over means a contract that's signed between Lawrence, the father, giving the son over to Lawrence for a 7-year term in which he becomes a member of the family and all of the work he does belongs to Lawrence. But in exchange for that, Lawrence gives him a bed, food, and training. Gives him a skill, okay? A skill that he can then take on afterwards, and good conversation. Not unimportant in all of this, as you'll see. So began what Frazee later described as his apprenticeship in, he calls it, the great art and mystery of the dirty, helter-skelter occupation of a country bricklayer and plasterer. So his apprenticeship under Lawrence provided him with solid training, unusual opportunities for advancement, and a familial intellectual environment. Frazee described the terms in his biography the following ways. When Lawrence had all his boys at home and seated around the winter's evening's fire, we constituted a sort of debating club. And could Newton and Archimedes have heard our wild and heterogeneous disquisitions and arguments upon science and laws, I'm sure they would have been highly and laughingly amused, if not enlightened. So what we have effectively is him becoming not just trained, but part of a conversation, a whole education with a community of people. It sounds a little like, a fraternity or a sorority or a communal family dinner. In 1810, in the last year of his apprenticeship, Frazee's hired out to work on a bank and Queen's College. What is Queen's College today? Anybody? Rutgers, right? In New Brunswick. Again, his employer, a man by the name of John Sandman, received him, as he described it, with particular courtesy and attention, much as a friend as an employee. And that's the difference. As much a friend, again, remember this difference between Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, somebody who's like a family member rather than somebody who's in this informal relationship. It's a personal rather than impersonal relationship. He took him about town, he provided accommodations for him, and he began to observe and work with New York stonecutters. He was enraptured with the mallet and chisel. He knew he had the ability to do that, and he discovered that Sandman was in fact a stonecutter, and he arranged to work 11 hours a day for him as a mason, and then 4 hours overtime every day, and at lunch, learning to chisel. So this was not a lazy guy. He was working 15, 16 hours a day in order to gain the skill of becoming a stonecutter, which he does. The last year and the last job before the exploration of his apprenticeship, Frazee put his new craft to work. And while working on a job in Nyack, New York, he convinced Lawrence, his earlier employer, a master, to let him tackle a mantelpiece that would require importing another stonecutter from New York. Frazee did the work, he did it extremely well, and he gained a reputation for himself. So he ultimately becomes quite famous. He later goes to Boston and becomes a sculptor. That's a later part of the story. Okay? The years after his apprenticeship, in fact, weren't easy. He struggled to do all that. He becomes successful only much later in his life. He does a lot of work simply making gravestones, which did not pay him a lot of money. The economy was not always great, but he gets by through much of this period. He gets enough to create an independent livelihood for himself, sufficient to support a small family. He is self-employed, okay? Increasingly well-known and respected. He goes to work in New York City, where he becomes an artisan and an artist, well-known increasingly for his work. So Frazee's career, you need to know, is not typical. Okay? He becomes a sculptor. Very few people become sculptors. Most became stonecutters. And that part of his career was pretty typical. The apprenticeship, working in those personal relations, and into the 20s and into the 30s. Also typical was the close personal relationship between artists and journeymen and masters. That was typical, an important piece of this story, because it begins to unravel the moment that NYU wants to hire stonecutters. Frazee, in 1831, took one of his own former apprenticeships into partnership, but by 1833, when stonecutters of New York were petitioning the legislature against prison labor, Frazee's already in Boston. His family, it should be noted, was not necessarily untouched by prison labor, for the 1834 petition carries the name Anson Frazee, undoubtedly or quite possibly a nephew or a brother who is involved in this dispute. So, by the 1830s, there was still some substantial continuity with the traditional patterns of previous generations, but now there are new market pressures. Something is beginning to change. It's beginning to undermine all those relations. And the key is to understand what we talked about before in this thing called an industrial revolution and those changes. And that industrial revolution was already causing workers to organize, to begin to think about how are we going to deal with this new thing called routinized work, with the division of labor in which I'm no longer making all of the job myself, but I'm only doing a piece of it. And they're willing to hire kids and women to do it at half the price, much more cheaply. Or we're being asked to work longer hours for less pay as dependent wage laborers. And we're an increasingly competitive place where people are undercutting me, offering to do it more cheaply. All this was upsetting, and the workers decide they better get together and deal with it. So they get together in New York as early as 1806. And the first group to get together to do this are the cordwainers, the shoemakers. And remember, I use them as the example about how work gets divided into tasks, into these pieces. So they get together to organize as a cordwainers union group. The city, the employers, take them to court. And we have a series of court cases in New York between 1806 and 1815 known as the Cordwainers Conspiracy Cases. Again, naming matters. It's not the employer's conspiracy case, it's the Cordwainers Conspiracy Case. And they are forbidden from unionizing, from forming a collective. It is argued they are in restraint of trade. They will not allow the, quote, free market to operate. So they are forbidden from organizing collectively. The employers are allowed to organize collectively to oppose them to do this, of course. That's called Chamber of Commerce. Okay? So there are, but the key again is who has power and where the law is and what the decisions that are being made. By the way, those same cases occur in Philadelphia and in Boston, but they're in New York too, so they're not allowed to organize. After the War of 1812, they continue to organize. They have a better advantage after the War of 1812. Mostly because there's a glut of labor. Okay? There's large numbers of people coming into the city. It made labor very cheap. Initially, that makes it hard for them to organize. They can be replaced very easily. So there's in 1823, the Hatters organized. That's called the New York Hatters case. And again, they lose. It's declared a conspiracy. So the courts remain firmly anti-union, anti-labor through all of this period, and largely through most of the 19th century. That remains the case, okay, in New York and most of these cities. One thing changes, the building of the Erie Canal. Remember, it's finished in 25 and 26, but the building of the canal required an enormous amount of labor. You take that labor from New York City, and what does that do to the labor market? What does it do to the labor market? If you suddenly need a large pool of labor to go upstate and to be building all of these canals, what does it do to the labor market in New York City? Okay.
It boosts the economy.
How? It reduces the supply. Okay? There's now a shortage of cheap labor. And if there's a shortage of cheap labor, what does it do to the labor force that's remaining? It increases their value, okay? Because they're needed more. So the building of the Erie Canal suddenly gives labor new authority. And they begin to organize again, but now they have some power to do so. And in the late 20s, 26 to 28, they form a group that is known in New York as the Workies. The Workies, or the Working Men's Parties. They organize, and New York City workers successfully win a 10-hour day. Okay? 10-hour day. Doesn't sound like a lot to many of you, I presume. Now we have the 8-hour day. But at the time, that was an enormous gain. It meant, among other things, you had a couple of hours that you might actually be able to go to school. And workers had created their own school in 1820 and public library in 1820. There was no such thing for anybody else. The General Society, Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York in 1820 creates the first public library in New York City, free public library. It's still free public library on West 44th Street, and a Mechanics Institute, as it's called, a free school before the public school system to allow its children to have an education. One need for that was to have time to be educated, so the 10-hour day was a major gain for them. And there's a leader for all of that, of this working men's parties. His name is Thomas Skidmore, like the college, a machinist, who organizes these mass meetings and helps to win this 10-hour day. He's an extraordinary man and worth noting very early in our history, in New York City's history, for some of the things that he puts on the table, and in putting on the table legitimizes them as things that can be talked about in New York City, even though they lose ultimately. What does he talk about? 10 hours. What else does he talk about? The equal right of every man and woman, Negro and white, to acquire property and education. So in fact, the school we talked about at the General Society allows women to be educated as well. And they help to support the development of a free black school also during this period. And it's coming out of these working men's parties. Skidmore also, however, believed that the only way these gains would be won was if there was a social revolution. That frightened people above him. And they begin very quickly to run a campaign against the working men's parties that he was leading, that he was an incendiary and un-American, and he ultimately loses. Though he manages during that time to have put on the table all of these important issues, 10-hour day, universal male suffrage, abolition of imprisonment for debt, which was always going mostly against poor people. The debtor's prison was almost entirely just for poor people. He supports the abolition of compulsory military. Again, the rich could always afford to do it. Poor didn't get paid if they had to go into the military, and the rich were free to hire somebody to take their place. So he was supporting the abolition of that. And he was opposing the abolition of chartered monopolies. Those were the banks, monopolistic bank practices. So these were things that were rather important principles to put into a public debate. But you could imagine how bankers might feel, who both wanted debtors' prisons. They wanted guarantees by the state that people would be forced to pay. They wanted to know that there was going to be an army, and they'd like the idea that they could use other people's bodies to fight rather than just their own. And they wanted banks to have the protection of the state, and if they could have less competition, it was one thing to talk about free trade and competition for everybody else, but if they could have a monopoly, that was even better. So they were not thrilled by the kinds of things that Skidmore was advancing, but he puts them on the table. Okay? Ultimately, he loses. Ultimately, he loses. He loses by 32 or 33, in part because the Democratic Party scapegoats him as a revolutionary and then takes on some of his principles and begins to advance them themselves as principles for the Democratic Party. So we'll pick up that story again a little later. Back to the journeymen, the marble cutters. The National Trades Union in 1833 summarizes the workers' problems. I'll quote from what they wrote. The expenses of living and supporting a family in this city, in New York, are annually increasing at the rate of 10 or 12%. Rents are enormously high. The Journal reported that landlords were asking for 25 to 40% increase in rents. Grocers were increasing prices as well. And when they did so, the journal concluded every other dealer must do the same, and the mechanic must pay more than he did last year for everything that his family eat, drink, or wear. So what we have, in other words, is a report from the local newspaper that this new thing called a market is rampantly just increasing prices. Okay? And there are no controls on it. The idea, remember, of a moral economy that might cap some of this and presume that there should be some kind of moral justice about what people could afford is thrown out the window. There's this new logic, a new celebration of a market economy, that the market ought to set fair prices. Okay? And whatever the market sets is de facto fair, because the market sets it. So the market is given this kind of status as a moral arbiter that didn't exist before. Well, the journeyman stonecutters weren't happy. That year, 325 journeyman marble cutters and master manufacturers of marble mantles sent petitions to the state legislature about the new conditions, claiming that prison labor, and I'm quoting from their petition, took the bread out of our mouths. The legislature's response was to do nothing. Now, the strains and ambivalence of the era also caught the title of the stonecutters' ally. They were called master marble manufacturers. So they were both masters, like in apprenticeships, and they're manufacturers. The title suggests, again, the transition that's occurring between people and their roles. Are they a master working with apprentices? Are they now manufacturers employing skilled workers? So their title suggests they're not quite sure. They're in this in-between world in which work is being transformed. And they're forming an alliance, however, with the stonecutters in filing this petition initially. So they recognize the common interest, because the manufacturers, after all, want the work. They don't want the prison labor doing it. So they have the same interest in doing it. In the ensuing months, an anti-prison labor campaign led by the stonecutters is joined by trade unionists who had organized the previous year, I discovered, into another organization called the General Trades Union of the City of New York. So in the same year that we have this riot, we have another organization that's formed called the General Trades Union of the City of New York. It is the first citywide labor federation. That's to say, we had groups of people, cordwainers, getting together and saying that we have a common interest. We had the hatters, we talked about them coming together. We might have sailmakers coming together. But now we have an organization that's saying that all of these workers have a common identity. What we're hearing is the beginning of an identity of themselves as a working class. A proto-class identity is what's forming in this kind of organization, not just an interest group identity. A list of some of the unions suggests the scope and appeal of this nascent labor movement, the beginning of the New York City and American labor movement. It included stonecutters, cordwainers, weavers, coopers, think again of the occupations in building a port city, right? Rope makers, builders, typographers, chair makers, hat makers, bakers, tailors, bookbinders, sailmakers, house carpenters, brush makers, silk hatters, and lady cordwainers, all of which were also part of the General Society and these other organizations. The preamble, however, to their constitution is the thing I want to focus on for a minute, because it tells us a great deal about how they understood the city and gives us, we begin to hear the voice of the stonecutters in that conversation. Here's the preamble to this General Trades Union. We, the journeymen, artisans, and mechanics of the city of New York and its vicinity, believing as we do that in proportion as the line of distinction between the employer and the employed is widened, hear that, believing as they do that there's a line of distinction widening between employers and employed. And as that happened, they're saying, that of the former is certainly approximated toward supremacy, that's to say the employer. And whatever system is calculated to make the many dependent upon or subject to the few not only tends to the subversion of the natural rights of man. Tom Paine, okay, those other little clauses in the Declaration of Independence, subversion of the natural rights of man, the Liberty Pole, all resurrecting, still resonating, but is hostile to the best interests of the community at large as well as to the spirit and genius of our government. So they're arguing in their document, which is meant to be a patriotic document, that essential to the best interests of the American government is in fact to understand that we need to have a society in which we are not having vassalage created. We're not having effectively feudalism recreated within a wage system in which power is increasingly vested in the hands of the few and everybody else is subject to them, the conditions of vassalage. That's what's happening when these stonecutters are going out on protest. They're informed by a growing sense of themselves as becoming vassals, and that somehow they have natural rights. And they gather in July of 34 to deal with the crisis that emboldened their plight. What was the crisis? Contract prison labor, because it wasn't just affecting stonecutters, it was affecting potentially all of them. The journeymen vowed, and I quote, "As mechanics and freemen, to protect our right, if the collective wisdom of the state neglect or refuse so doing, and prevent their being monopolized by the convicts or agents of the state prison." "80 men present signed resolutions against what they call the state prison monopoly." So again, hearing it, the language they're using is that they're really opposing monopoly. Okay? That will be, again, a cause that will resonate through American history. That's how it was being fought out from their perspective. They're being denied their rights to organize because it's being told they're a combine, they're a monopoly. They're using the same language to say the prison is being given a monopoly of the trade in the same kind of way. But at the same time as these mechanics persisted in exhausting legislative appeals, they resolved not to do any work that convicts had dressed or to employ anyone who worked on contract prison labor from any state. Alas, the workers' appeals fell on deaf ears, both in Albany and on the university governors. The work of the building proceeded under the direction of the contractor, whose name was Elijah Bloomer. Very famous name in New York University's history, or he should be. He was a man infamous for his introduction of prison labor in the manufacture, not just of stone cutting work, but of the manufacture of silk hats, marble chimney pieces, grates, and locks. So he was using contract prison labor to make everything he could. NYU now hires him. On the evening of October 24th, 1834, the stonecutters, joined by their allies now in this fledgling labor movement, organized a series of lengthy parades with banners and placards proclaiming their rights and denouncing the local men who had contracted for the prison labor. Between 100 and 150 of these protesters then decided to bring their protest to the marble works of the contractor himself, Elijah Bloomer, whose shop was 160 Broadway near 4th Street.
When using prison labor, who was paid for was the state giving a sum of money for the prison labor?
No, the state does it for free. This prison labor is free from the state. And they then give the stone free to Bloomer, who then who does the work for the university, the free labor. Between 9 and 10 that evening, the stonecutters walked up Broadway, in what the correspondent for the Commercial Advertiser described as, quote, "a quiet and orderly manner, creating no suspicion, as it were, supposed by those who saw them, as if they were just returning from church." When they reached Bloomer's shop, their anger boiled over, and they petitioned Bloomer with rocks and brickbats. Doors and windows were smashed, and some marble manters were destroyed. In response, and undoubtedly at the behest of the contractor, the mayor, for the third time that year, called on the 27th Regiment to disperse the crowd. No one seems to have been arrested, and what passed down to us as the Stonecutters riot in Headley's account supposedly ended. Indeed, it didn't. And what I discovered in my research is that the crowd did not solve the problem of prison labor, though tempers cooled for a while as the military remained on parade ground in Washington Square Park for days. An important and revealing sequel to the October demonstration occurred the following year. The industrialization of the stonecutters' work, the increase in the number of stonecutters with seasonal labor markets, meant that there was an increased division of labor in stone cutting. That's to say, remember the term master manufacturers. There are all kinds of changes, and the stonecutters' work was changing as well. A third of the stonecutters worked for $2 a day. 2/3 worked by the piece, did piecework. Okay? They'd be paid for whatever piece they did, but not by the day. The cheaper labor always threatened to undermine them all, however. Say whatever cost less was what the manufacturers wanted to use. So in April of 1835, the next year, the journeymen paid by the day, which was the better rate, went out on strike on behalf of their poorly paid brothers. So what we have now is the stonecutters who are being paid by the day, going out on strike in behalf of the stonecutters who are being paid cheaply. Okay, piecework. Saying they should not be allowed to be paid piecework. Everyone should be paid a day's work. This was, to be fair, not a selfless act entirely, because the strike, if they lost it, they'd all be being paid by the piecework. So they were protecting their own interests as well. So it was trying to protect their own wages. In early June, shortly after that, the Association of Journeymen Stonecutters of New York and Brooklyn won acceptance of manufacturers of a list of prices, according to which any stonecutter who worked 10 hours would receive the $2 rate. So they win $2. In victory, the National Trades Union, the first national newspaper of labor, recognized the extraordinarily heroic character of the stonecutters' brotherly action. Quote, "They deserve and we trust and will receive the hearty thanks of all their brotherly mechanics." All was, however, not as rosy as this image of brotherly solidarity suggests. The prison labor reemerges in 1835. Following this 1834 protest, in the run-up to the fall of 1834 elections, the Democratic and the Whig politicians all expressed support for the stonecutters. Vote for us and we'll get rid of prison labor. So, of course, they get voted for, and of course they do nothing. A month later, in March of 35, after the politicians, the state legislature does nothing, the Association of Journeymen and Stonecutters of New York and Brooklyn holds a general meeting and unanimously elects a committee of 5 to renew opposition to the prison monopoly. Okay? 5 people to lead, and just want you to, you'll hear a couple of names in this. That's the only piece of this final part of the story. The stonecutters reiterated their opposition in strong, unequivocal language, quote, "to effect the speedy annihilation of the diabolical system of this detested material manufactured from it, and of all the men who contracted for such labor from the den of thieves." The committee urged all brother mechanics and others who might be members of fire companies not to assist at the extinguishment of any fire wherein, on or about any said fire, may in any way be composed of goods manufactured in the state prison. Remember I told you the firemen would play a role in our continuing story? So here we see that they're calling upon their brothers in these volunteer fire companies, who are actually their literal brothers. They're their neighbors. They're their friends. They, in fact, were sometimes the same people. They joined volunteer fire companies and they were stonecutters. And they said, if there's a fire that breaks out in a scab industry, and an industry employing scab prison labor, don't put it out. So you can hear how the politics of professionalization and the firemen And the solidarities of these community organizations all overlap in this kind of struggle. Fire companies were drawn from this kind of ethnic working class community. And we'll see this even in the film Gangs of New York later on. In any case, the committee who wrote these militant resolutions consisted of 5 stonecutters, as I mentioned, 2 of whose names were Gilbert Cameron and James Hughes. And our story will end with their names. They would appear in quite different guises, roles, scarcely 4 months later. So 2 of the 5 members, Cameron and Hughes, are now writing these resolutions against the den of thieves, telling the firemen not to put out their fires. What happens 4 months later? On July 18th, Cameron and Hughes write a letter to the National Trades Union to complain against the Stonecutters Association that they had just recently served. As entrepreneurial journeymen, they had crossed a thin line in those 4 months. It was the same line those master manufacturers had tried to walk. They now took the idea, however, of Republican rights and natural rights, the rights of man, to which the stonecutters had so frequently referred in the past year, and they now use the same language in behalf of free trade. That's to say, Republican rights was like a Rorschach. You could use it for whatever purposes you want. They took on now the voices of the men of commerce and insisted on the right to establish their own manufactory of stonecutting and to subcontract with whomever they pleased, including Elijah Bloomer if need be. They had built a shop on 19th Street and employed 10 to 12 stonecutters. Though, as I've mentioned, the problem was they had now contracted with the infamous Elijah Bloomer, the prison labor contractor who had built NYU's building. So the events, and their complaint was the stonecutters, in response, had decided that they would not allow any of the tools in their shop to be sharpened by any union labor elsewhere. So they're fighting now against people who had been their brothers just 4 months earlier, whose role is now shifting. So the events of 1835, I want to argue, can be seen as a logical extension of 1834 and expose what I would argue is shifting and conflicting roles and identities of workers at a time when master manufacturers were ejecting other prison labor manufacturers, while journeymen were going out on strike on behalf of their less well-paid brethren, and while 2 journeymen themselves outspoken leaders of prison monopoly, had seen their own identities and interests shift dramatically as they become manufacturers themselves. Upset by the journeymen's opposition to their use of prison labor, Cameron and Hughes complete their intellectual and political somersault. When the trade union journeymen convinced this local blacksmith not to sharpen their offending tools, Cameron and Hughes press criminal charges against the union as a conspiracy of trade. And ironically, 3 of the, quote, conspirators based on Cameron and Hughes' testimony are then sent to prison by them. So it would have been a fitting irony if the stonecutters sent to prison found themselves required to do contract prison labor, but I can't tell you that that happened. I suspect that's more the stuff of melodrama. Martin Scorsese would make something of it, but I will not. We know nothing of the prison term. We do know is that the stonecutters' protest made Sing Sing labor, hewing stone, politically impossible, and eventually, but not until 1884, was it made illegal, and only then when some working men were elected to the New York State Legislature. So what do we, in conclusion, make of this history? How does this history reflect on Headley's referencing the riot as part of his call for more police as a way to provide more security? I would argue, in conclusion, that the logic of the counting house saw crowd behavior for workers as riotous, as the actions of an unthinking mob. According to such accounts, when they threw stones, stonecutters were irrational, backward-looking men who undermined this logic. The logic with efficiencies and technological change were supposedly thought to be inevitable and progress, and always progress. The history of the protest, 34 and 35, the extent to which it was set offers an alternative stonecutter's logic. The Erie Canal, the new elite spaces of the new park, Washington Square, the handsome townhouses on the north side, the rise of NYU's new marble building, all bespeak a new view of industrial progress in the industrial metropole. But if economic achievement was real for merchants and entrepreneurs, for most stonecutters and New York's working class, the image of progress was but an image. For stonecutters and undoubtedly many of the mechanics of the city, an equally pertinent reality was that of the rapacious contractor Elijah Bloomer and the overwhelming force of the National Guard, backed up by the mayor, the state legislature, and the judiciary, consistently arrayed against them. For the petitioning mechanics and stonecutters, the social problem was industrial capitalism, or in their words, a system that increased the line of distinction between the employer and the employed toward a state of vassalage. For such men, the throwing of stones was not a riot so much as participatory democracy in a society that had turned a deaf ear toward them. For these mechanics, protest may be seen as much as a part of an alternative educative process, not to simply learn the lessons of the boss's order, but to learn those of trade unionism and worker solidarity. In such a way, would argue that the stonecutters' protest was but the beginning of the urban workers' modern struggle for social justice. The naming of the event as the Stonecutters' Riot blinds us to that meaning, much as it dictated an appropriate response to be a repressive police response. One can only wonder what social policy response might have occurred had the event been parsed and passed down to succeeding generations with the stonecutters' meaning of it. I propose we rename the event the outsourcing abomination of 1834 and think about how social policy of that in subsequent days may play out differently. Such is the presentness of the past. Thank you.